Go Loud presents Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Brought to you by Revive Active, Ireland's #1 vitamin and dietary supplement brand. Find out more at reviveactive.com or your local pharmacy and health food stores.
Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is presented by Go Loud, Ireland's leading audio publisher and the home of Irish podcasts. Find new episodes on the podcast first on the Go Loud app and on your favourite podcast platform. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I'm your host Nules, and I'm so grateful to have you with me here today. Now, before we open today's case file, I want to talk to you about a new ritual I've brought into my own morning. We're delighted to be joined by our new sponsor, Revive Active. If you're like me, your mornings are a little bit of a whirlwind, and the last thing you want is a handful of tablets to have to take. Revive Active is an Irish brand that's simplified everything. It's one single sachet with 26 vitamins, minerals and amino acids that's simply mixed into water to create a really tasty drink. It's become my daily ritual before I sit down to research cases. It's easy, it's effective, and it's made right here in Ireland. You can find your 30-day supply at reviveactive.com or your local pharmacy or health food store. On the 3rd of June 2011, just after 6:30 in the morning, a 52-year-old man left a farmhouse outside Tipperary town in a silver Citroen van. The woman watching him from her kitchen window noticed it took him a little bit longer than usual to cross the cattle grid at the gate. He never made it to work that morning. He was never seen again. His name was Bobby Ryan, and to the dance halls and weddings and parish socials all over the south of Ireland, he was Mr Moonlight. I'm Nules, and welcome to this week's episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. This is a case that took the guts of a decade to play out. A man vanishes on a June morning and his family wait 22 months to find out what happened to him. What follows is one of the longest murder trials in the history of the state. And after it, appeal after appeal, the whole way up to the Supreme Court, over a question that had never really been asked in an Irish court before. This is a big story now, so I'm going to be, again, splitting it into two. So you're now listening to part one, and part one is about Bobby himself, who he was, the morning he disappeared, the 22 months his family lived not knowing what had happened to him, and the day they finally brought him home and buried him. The investigation, the trial, all about the appeals, and what his daughter had to say only last month in May of 2026, all that will be in part two. So let's get into it. Now, his legal name was Robert Ryan, but nobody ever called him that. To his daughter, to his son, to the lads at the quarry, to every crowd he played to at a dance, he was just Bobby. He grew up on Friar Street in Cashel, in a house only yards from the church of St John the Baptist, and that is the very church his children would bury him in 2 years later. By 2011, he was living in a little village outside of Cashel called Boherlahan. The morning he left Mary Lowry's house, he had on him a navy polo neck shirt, navy tracksuit bottoms, a navy jumper and a pair of white runners. He drove a truck out of Killock Quarry in Tipperary, and he was the kind of worker any employee would want. He never missed a day, he was never late. He was up at all hours for early starts and never had a word of complaint out of him. His boss thought the world of him. Bobby had been married before, but it hadn't worked out. The marriage ended in or around 2005, and it really hit him hard. He went through a low patch back then, a bad spell. But that was years before any of this. I'm only saying this because it matters a small bit later in the very early days when he was first missing. It was nothing to do with how it ended. He had 2 children he doted on, his daughter Michelle and his son Robert Jr., and he was also a grandfather. To the grandchildren, he was Granda Bob, and he was especially close to his daughter Michelle. Dads and their daughters, isn't that what they say? After the marriage ended, Bobby threw himself into dancing. He learned the jive, he learned the waltz, and music and dancing became his whole social life. For anyone who doesn't know it, social dancing was always a big thing in rural Ireland. It always was, as I said. And it was coming back big time around that time. Halls and hotels and pubs, the length and breadth of Munster were putting on dancing nights, and crowds of people were out jiving and waltzing and having great crack. A lot of them on their own and looking for a bit of company, and Bobby was right in the middle of all that. It was where he was his happiest. Bobby Ryan was also a part-time DJ and he loved it, so you can understand why the two overlapped, his love of music and his love of dancing. And he went by the name Mr Moonlight. And he was fierce proud of that name. He had it written in big letters right across the windscreen of his silver Citroen van that he hauled all of his decks and his speakers and his lights around in. His disco kit, the van just personified Bobby. Everybody knew it coming down the road. He had a regular Saturday night spot in Pat Fox's pub in Cashel, and he played the Brian Brew also. He played birthday parties and socials all over the south of Tipperary, and he played anything from the Wolf Tones to ABBA, whatever got the crowd going. There's one detail about him that says more than any list of pubs could. When Bobby finished a set, it'd take him the guts of an hour to get out the door because he was chatting to everybody. He was easygoing and everybody loved him, and they'd be all flocking over to say hello to him. There was always one more person he hadn't finished talking to. One man who knew him from those nights said Bobby would come in with all of his old school CDs, set up at the back, play the 80s classics and take requests off the punters between songs, and the crack, he said, was mighty. He said everyone just loved him. He was full of chat, never in bad form. And that's Bobby, by every single account of every single person who knew him. Mary Lowry, who we'll come to shortly, called him a breath of fresh air, fun and funny and full of life, and said he loved her three boys and they loved him back. His own Michelle called him one of a kind, always with a smile on his face, a loving father, a happy-go-lucky man who had never done a bad turn to a soul. Years later, when this had all been through the courts, one of the most senior judges in the country described Bobby Ryan as a busy man of wide interests. And he was. In August of 2010, at a dance in Tipperary, Bobby met a woman called Mary Lowry, the lady I just mentioned. She was a good 8 years younger than him. He asked her up for a dance and she said yes, and the two of them hit it off straight away over the same love of dancing and music and jive. But to understand what happened to Bobby, you need to understand Mary Lowry's house and the farm it sat on, and the man who lived up the road. The farm was at a place called Fánagown, out the country outside Tipperary town. Mary Lowry was a Tipperary woman, born in Newport in 1966, and she had married a man called Martin Lowry. The two of them lived in Fánagown with their three sons. In September of 2007, Martin Lowry died of cancer. He was a young man still, and it left Mary widowed in her early 40s with three boys to rear on her own and a working farm to keep going on top of it. Anyone who's lived in the country knows what a farm is. It doesn't stop just because you're grieving. The cows still have to be milked and the work still has to be done, death or no death. So Mary Lowry was a woman who badly needed somebody to lean on. Now, Martin had a sister called Imelda, and Imelda was married to a dairy farmer from a townsland nearby, a man named Patrick Quirk. Pat, everybody called him. And Pat Quirk was no stranger to that family. He had been the best man at Martin and Mary's wedding. He and Martin were close, brothers-in-law and good friends. Pat and Imelda and their children were in and out of Fánagown all the time. This was family helping family, the way it has always been done in the countryside. And there wouldn't have been a soul who thought anything of it. And to look at him, Pat Quirk was the last man you'd ever suspect of anything. Respectable, not a blemish on him. Never in trouble a day in his life. He was in a local investment club. He had a few properties, a successful dairy farmer with his own land and his own good standing, a pillar of the community, you could say. So when Martin died, it was Pat who stepped in to give his widow a hand with the farm and with her money. The decent thing to do for your dead best friend's wife. Except that within a few months of Martin being in the ground, in early 2008, Pat Quirk and Mary Lowry were having an affair. Him a married man, her the widow of his best friend. And that is where this story begins. And I hope you're able to follow all the interconnections there and the intertwinings of all the various relationships. So, moving on, in April of 2008, Pat Quirke took out a lease on the land at Faunagown, a 7-year lease, and the price on paper was $12,600 a year. But once the EU farm payment on the land was taken off it, the actual cost to Quirke for the use of Mary Lowry's farm came down to $1,600 a year. €1,600 for a whole farm for a whole year. He was working his dead best friend's land for next to nothing. And it didn't stop at the land. He had his fingers right through her finances. He took 80,000 of Mary Lowry's money and put it into what they call contracts for difference, which for anyone who's never heard of them, and that's most of us I can say, are a high risk way of gambling on the markets. The kind of thing that can make you money fast and lose it even faster. €80,000 of a widow's money put into that by the man she was sleeping with. He took a loan off her as well, €20,000. No paperwork, no arrangement to pay it back. There would be a row about that later. He said she had agreed to write it off over a cattle disease he'd had on the land. She said different. And it was never really squared between them. And there was one more thing, and this is the one that's a real belter. There had even been a provision in Mary Lowry's will that would have left €100,000 to the Quirkes to help care for her children if anything ever happened to her. The brother-in-law of her dead husband, working her land for a pittance, minding her money, sleeping with her, and written into her will in case something might happen to her. That is how tangled up in this woman's life Pat Quirke was by the time Bobby Ryan ever came near her. 2.5 years of a secret affair, her land, her 80 grand, the loan, the will, and a wife of his own on top of that who was, don't forget, the sister of Mary's dead husband. So this was a man who was deep into Mary Lowry's life. Her money, her land, her future, all of it bound up with him. And then along comes Bobby Ryan, a truck driver and a weekend DJ from Cashel with his van and his music and his easy way with people. A man with nothing to offer but himself. He had no land, no investments, no hold over her of any kind. And Mary Lowry chose him. That is the world Bobby Ryan walked into when he asked Mary Lowry up for that dance. And there is nothing anywhere to say he had the first clue about any of it. Bobby and Mary started seeing each other after that dance in August of 2010. He got her tickets to the All-Ireland hurling final that year, and from there it became a regular thing, easy going by all accounts. He'd call out to her during the week, stay over the odd time. Mary's in-laws were happy for her. Bobby's son thought it mightn't last, but Michelle was close to her dad and was at a few of his DJ nights while it was all going on. Then, late in 2010, two things happened about the same time. Mary Lowry ended the affair with Pat Quirke, the one that had been going on now for the guts of 2.5 years. And Pat Quirke found out about Bobby Ryan. Now, I want to be straight with you before I go on. Everything I'm about to tell you was gone through, every bit of it, in open court, the whole way up to the Supreme Court. It was given in evidence and picked over by barristers on both sides. So I'm not making a word of anything up. And to be honest with you, you couldn't really make it up. Pat Quirke took Mary's phone. He sent texts off it to Bobby. He rang Bobby off it and he said one line to him: "I'm the man." There was a meeting then between the three of them in Hayes' hotel in Thurles. Bobby, Mary and Pat Quirke. And they shook hands on it. And here's the thing. Because Quirke himself, in his own statement to Gardaí afterwards, said Bobby was very friendly and sympathetic about the whole thing, that there was no real outcome to the meeting. That was how Pat Quirke described Bobby. But the minute he had Mary on her own, the story changed, and he told her Bobby, in his word, smells. In January of 2011, Mary came home to her house and found Pat Quirke hiding behind her porch door. In February of 2011, Pat Quirke wrote into the Agony Aunt column of a Sunday newspaper the Dear Patricia column under a false name and poured his heart out about falling in love with a family friend, the widow of his best friend, and being left broken when she took up with another man. A man, he wrote, who could give her everything he couldn't. They printed it that February under the heading, "I'm bereft now, affair with my best friend's widow is over." Anonymous in the paper, but by all accounts, it was him. And then, the very next day, Mary Lowry got a letter from Tusla, the child protection people, saying there'd been reports her children weren't being looked after properly. Tusla looked into it and found there was nothing in it at all. Not a thing. And where had those reports come from? Allegedly, Pat Quirke. In the space of 6 months, from August 2010 to February 2011, you have the end of the affair, the taking of her phone, the "I'm the man" call, the hotel meeting he twisted behind her back, the hiding behind the porch door, the letter to the national paper under a made-up name, and a false report to Tusla against the children of his own dead best friend. That was all within 6 months. And the whole time, Bobby Ryan hadn't a notion. He went to work, he played his dances as Mr Moonlight, he spent his time with his children. There is nothing anywhere to suggest he had any idea what was going on around Mary Lowry on the farm. By the summer of 2011, it had got serious between Bobby and Mary. They were going away together as a couple, and the very last weekend of Bobby Ryan's life was spent away with her up in Bundoran in County Donegal. It wasn't a perfect weekend. They'd had a bit of a row. Mary felt Bobby was paying too much attention to another woman they had met, though she'd later say it was only Bobby being Bobby because he was friendly with everyone. They fell out for a day or two over it, but patched it up by the time they came home. He dropped her back and he went to Cashel and back to his own routine. He worked in the quarries Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. The Thursday was the 2nd of June 2011, and it was Robert Jr.'s birthday. That evening, Bobby drove the van out to Mary's at Faunagown to stay the night and got there a little after 9 o'clock. And the last phone call Bobby Ryan ever made in his life, he made at 9 o'clock that night to his son, a birthday call. Years later, Robert sat down with his sister Michelle and told the whole country the last words his father ever said to him. It was my birthday on the 2nd of June, and he said, "I'll see you later on." I didn't get to see him again after that. "I'll see you later on." Bobby stayed the night at Faunagown. Around 6 o'clock, 6:30 that morning, the Friday, Bobby woke. He and Mary had been together that morning before he got up and dressed to go. And at about 6:30, he walked out of the house and got into his van. Mary was at the kitchen window and she watched him drive across the yard and down towards the gate. And she said afterwards it took him longer than usual to get across the cattle grid on the way out. That was the last anyone ever saw of him alive. Now, shortly after Bobby left, Mary said she saw Pat Quirke at the farm. And she said he looked hot and sweaty and bothered. And there's another sighting of Quirke that morning worth telling you about. There was a woman, Breda O'Dwyer, who was an artificial inseminator who'd been calling out to the Quirke's own farm in Brenshmore regularly as clockwork for 15 years. And she said that morning, for the first time in all of those 15 years, Pat Quirke was still inside in the milking parlour at 9:30. Any other morning, he'd have been long finished and gone, but not that morning. And there's two more things about that morning, because they tell you where Bobby's van went and where his phone went after 6:30. A woman was passing the woods at Bancha, Kilshane Woods, around 8 o'clock that morning, and she saw a silver van parked up there. When she came back past that same spot about 50 minutes later, the van was gone. And Bobby's mobile phone, the records showed it last pinged off a mast at Krog Motors on the Cashel Road that morning. And that mast is only a few fields from Faunagown. That was the last contact Bobby Ryan's phone ever had with anything, anywhere. Now, I have to be fair here. Mary Lowry gave her account of seeing Quirke at the farm twice. Once in 2011 when Bobby was only missing, and again in 2013 after he was found. And the defence would later argue hard that those two accounts didn't match up, that she wasn't to be relied on. The jury heard all of that argument, and I'll come back to that in part 2. And Quirk himself denied being at Mary's place that morning at all, so that sighting was disputed, and I'll be straight with you about that. But here's what the jury heard about that morning. Bobby left Mary's at 6:30. His phone last pinged a few fields away. His van was seen up at the woods at 8 and gone again by 10 to 9. And at 9:30, Pat Quirk was still in his own milking parlour, something Breda O'Dwyer said was unusual after 15 years of calling to that farm. Bobby didn't turn up for his shift at the quarry that Friday morning, and that was the first sign something was badly wrong, because this was a man who did not miss work, ever. His daughter Michelle started ringing around looking for him, and that Friday afternoon Michelle and an aunt went into the Garda station in Tipperary town to report him missing. Now, when they were giving the report, the aunt mentioned that Bobby had suffered with depression in the past and said she was worried he might have done something to himself. And that one detail shaped how Gardaí treated the whole thing in the early days. They went at it as a missing person who might have harmed himself, not as anything more sinister. There is nothing, and I want to be very clear about this, nothing to say Bobby took his own life that morning. And it was never where any of this ended up, and that's why, at the start, it was treated the way it was. And that afternoon, Michelle drove out to the car park at Kilshanewood, Banchawood, out the country outside Tipperary town, and there, sitting abandoned in the car park, Michelle found her father's van. And straight away there was a few things about it that didn't make any sense. His DJ gear was still in the back, all of it. The gear that was Bobby's livelihood and his pride and his joy was just sitting there. The doors were unlocked. The van left in gear, not in neutral. And the driver's seat shoved into a position that Bobby would never have had it in. Now, Michelle knew her father, and she knew that van, and she told Gardaí straight out, her father was not the last person to drive it. She knew how he sat, she knew where he kept that seat, and that seat was in the wrong position. A small thing, you might think, the position of a seat, but it's the kind of thing a child knows about a parent without even thinking about it. And Michelle was certain somebody else had driven that van and left it there. And of course, we know now what that poor girl couldn't have known standing in that car park, that her father's van had already been seen up there hours earlier that morning and had already driven away again while she was still at home wondering where he was. The day after Bobby disappeared, Gardaí put out an official missing persons appeal and asked anyone with information to come forward. And within a few days, they were out at Faunagowan. They searched the sheds, the outhouses, walked the land. And Pat Quirk was there while they did it all. He was the tenant, the man farming the place after all. And what came out later at the trial was that during one of those searches, Pat Quirk told Gardaí there was only 2 tanks on the land, only 2. When the prosecution would argue he knew well there was a third. Gardaí never looked inside an old, disused tank, a runoff tank, that had once taken dirty water out of the milking parlour, sitting in the ground right beside the milking parlour, less than 100 yards from where Bobby was last seen alive. Nobody pointed them to it. And Bobby Ryan's body would lie in that tank, on the land Pat Quirk was farming for nearly 2 years. To Michelle, to Robert Jr., to his ex-wife, to the lads at the quarry, to every crowd he'd ever played a dance for, Bobby Ryan was just gone. He'd just vanished. Gardaí put out appeals. They went on crime call that September after he disappeared, and again the following January. They put his description out, asked anyone who'd seen anything to come forward, and nothing came back that brought his family one step closer to where he was. That's a particular kind of torture that the families of the missing in this country live with. And we've talked about it before on this podcast. There's no body, there's no funeral, there's no grave to go to, no day in court. There's only the question, over and over, where is he? What has happened to him? Is there any chance at all the phone might ring? And it never lets up. It sits at the table at Christmas. It's there every birthday, every anniversary. And in those early days, the family did everything they could to find him. They organised searches, they put up posters, they walked the fields and the bog and the woodland. They went on the radio and the television appealing for anyone who knew anything. Michelle in particular never stopped. She was her father's daughter, as I said, after all, and she would not let it go. But a man does not just vanish off the face of the earth on his way to work of a morning. Somebody, somewhere, knew where Bobby Ryan was, and for 22 months nobody said a word. Think about what that does to a family. They had no idea in all that time that Bobby was lying in the ground a stone's throw from the last place he was seen alive. They drove those roads, they searched that countryside, and he was there the whole time on the farm next door to where he'd spent his last night, and not one of them knew it. Michelle and Robert Jr. lived with that torture for the guts of 2 years. And it wasn't only Bobby's children. Bobby had a brother, John, and as far back as 2012, while Bobby was still a missing person and that tank was still sitting unsearched in the ground, John Ryan came out and said publicly what he believed had happened to his brother. He believed Bobby had been murdered a full year before his body was ever found. And meanwhile, back at Faunagown, life went on. And what went on out there in those months and years after Bobby vanished is hard to think about. That September, only about 3 months after Bobby disappeared, Pat Quirke told Gardaí that he and Mary Lowry were back together. The affair rekindled, and he pointed to a night away at the Cliff House Hotel in Ardmore in Waterford. Mary's account was that she did no such thing. She did not spend the night with him, although there was a payment of over €400 out of her account to that hotel. And that was never fully squared, one way or the other. It was disputed. Then, in January of 2012, the two of them, both sides agree on this, were at Fitzpatrick's Hotel in Killiney in Dublin. But Mary's account is that she hadn't wanted to be there, that she'd drunk too much, that she left the next morning, and she flatly denied they were back together. Quirke said different. Disputed again. That March, around Paddy's weekend, Mary Lowry met another man and started seeing him. In August of 2012, there was a terrible tragedy in the Quirke household. Pat Quirke's son Alan, who was only 11, was killed in a farm accident. And I want to say this, that child's death has nothing whatsoever to do with what happened to Bobby Ryan. The only reason that I'm mentioning it is that it came up later in the trial as Quirke's own explanation for something on his computer, and we'll get to that. But that family lost an 11-year-old boy in a separate tragedy entirely. That September, Mary Lowry's passport went missing out of her house, and when she tackled Quirke about it, his answer was, "I sold it and made money off it." He'd say after that he was only being smart. And then we come to the 3rd of December 2012. By 2012, Mary Lowry had CCTV put up around her house, and the reason was simple enough. Her house alarm had been going off more than once, and nobody could figure out why or who was setting it off. On the 3rd of December 2012, that camera caught Pat Quirke in her yard. The jury was shown the footage. There he is, peering in her windows, lifting her underwear off the clothesline, going through her postbox, and then putting a key into her front door. At which point, the alarm goes off, and that's where the footage ends. So think about who this man was meant to be to her. The brother-in-law of her dead husband, the best man at her wedding, the fellow who stepped in to mind her farm and her money when she was widowed, the man there'd even been talk of putting in her will, and there he is, caught on her own cameras, creeping around her windows, taking her underwear off the line, going through her post, letting himself in her front door with a key. This is one of the most disturbing things I have ever come across in any case in this country, and I don't say that lightly, believe me. And there's something else about that same day, and I'll only touch on it now because we'll go through it in detail in part 2. That very same afternoon, Quirke was caught at Mary's house. A computer in his own home was used for a search, and I give it to you word for word. Human body decomposition timeline. That same afternoon, that computer was used to read about how a body decomposes. and to read up on the limits of DNA evidence. The underwear off the line, the body decomposition searches the same afternoon. And at that point, Bobby Ryan had been missing 18 months, and his body would later be found in that tank. There would be an almighty legal battle later over those computers, how Gardaí got them and whether any of it could be used at all, but I'll save that, as I said, for part 2. Later that same month, Mary Lowry's solicitor wrote to Quirk ending his lease on the land. He wrote back looking for compensation, and after a bit of back and forth, he agreed to go without it. The lease had years left to run on paper. It wouldn't have ended naturally until 2015, but by the start of 2013, Pat Quirk had agreed to walk away from Fánagáin. On the afternoon of Tuesday, the 30th of April 2013, a little after 1 o'clock, a Garda by the name of Tom Neville got a phone call. It was Imelda Quirk, Pat's wife. She was ringing to say her husband had found a body out at Fánagáin in an old disused runoff tank beside the milking parlour, less than 100 yards, as I said, from the bedroom window of the house Bobby Ryan had walked out of nearly 2 years earlier. Gardaí went out, and one of them, an inspector by the name of Padraig Powell, when he got there, he found Pat and Imelda Quirk sitting together on a low wall. Quirk brought him over to the tank, where a concrete slab had been pulled back off the top of it. And here's the odd thing. Pat Quirk's hands were extremely clean for a man who'd supposedly spent the morning working with slurry. Quirk made a voluntary statement to the Gardaí that day. He said he'd been opening the tank to draw water out of it for slurry. He said when he lifted the first slab, what he saw inside looked at first like a carpet or maybe an inflatable doll. And then he lifted the second slab, and this is his account of that day. He said he knew straight away it was a body, and he knew straight away it was Bobby Ryan. The body was lying under that slab. They recovered the remains, and it was Bobby. Missing since 6:30 on the morning of the 3rd of June 2011. 22 months. He'd been stripped naked. The body was badly decomposed after nearly 2 years being sealed in that tank. And spare a thought for the family that day. For 22 months they had held on to some small thread of hope, the way all families do when somebody is missing belonged to them, that maybe somehow he was still out there alive. That hope was well and truly gone on the 30th of April 2013. There would be no happy ending. There would be no Bobby walking back in the door. He had been found, and the manner of how and where he had been found told its own story before a single word was ever said in a courtroom. There he was, in the ground, in the tank, on the land Pat Quirk had been farming. And it was Quirk who said he found him, and Quirk's wife who would ring the Gardaí. For 22 months, Michelle and Robert Jr. had been living with the worst question a family can be asked to live with. And that afternoon, the 30th of April 2013, they got the worst answer to it. The post-mortem was done the next day, the 1st of May, by a Dr. Khalid Jabber, the deputy state pathologist at the time. Bobby's body had a lot of broken bones. A scan of the remains found that the breaks to his skull and his face had been caused by at least 4 separate blows from something blunt. Fractures to the skull, fractures to the face, broken ribs, a broken thigh bone. The cause of death, blunt force trauma. Now exactly how he got those injuries would be fought over tooth and nail at the trial. Whether it was a deliberate beating with some object or whether, as the defence would argue, it could have been a vehicle that did it. The jury heard all of that. And here's what was never in dispute by anyone at any stage. Bobby Ryan died of severe blunt force injuries to his head, his face, his ribs and his leg. Somewhere after he walked out of Mary Lowry's house at 6:30 that morning, he got those injuries. And his body was stripped and put into a sealed concrete tank on the land Pat Quirk farmed, less than 100 yards from the door he'd walked out of. It was nearly 3 weeks before the family could bring Bobby home. On Sunday, the 19th of May 2013, his remains were released to them, and he was brought home to Cashel, to the Church of St John the Baptist, the same church his family had grown up around, only doors from the house he was reared in on Friar Street. His funeral was the next morning, nearly 2 years to the month since he'd walked out of Mary Larry's house, and they buried him in the cemetery there, yards from where he grew up. The priest who said the funeral mass was Father Bernie Maloney, and he said 2 things about Bobby that day. He said Bobby had music in his heart and soul, and he said that Mr Moonlight had touched the hearts of many and set the lips laughing and the feet dancing. And at his graveside, his daughter Michelle stood up and spoke. I'll give you 3 things she said that day, and then I'll leave it there for part 1. The first, Dad should be ringing us now from his truck on his tea break or lunch break, spending 20 minutes talking about nothing. The second, God didn't take Daddy from us. Someone else playing God did that. And we're asking God today to give us some justice that Daddy deserves. And the third, I'm not going to say goodbye to Daddy because that's too final. And I know wherever we go, he's going to be mooching in, thinking he would miss something. So I'm just going to say that I'll see you later. I'll see you later. The very same words Bobby had said to his own son on the phone at 9 o'clock on the night of the 2nd of June, on Robert's birthday. The last words Robert ever heard his father say. And I'll leave it there for part 1. Robert Ryan, Bobby, Mr Moonlight, a father, a grandfather, a hard-working, well-liked man who walked out of a house outside Tipperary town at 6:30 on a June morning to go to work, the same as he did every morning of his life. And 22 months later his children buried him in Cashel, in the ground a few doors from the house he was reared in. A horrible end for poor Bobby. There's no other way to put it. But what came after, the investigation, the search of Quirk's house, and what the Gardaí found in it, the years of waiting on an arrest, the trial, the appeals, all the way to the Supreme Court, and what Michelle said only last month in May of 2026. It's the kind of thing you'd swear was made up if it wasn't all on the record. That's part 2. So join me next week for the rest of Bobby Ryan's story on Ireland Crimes and Mysteries, and thanks again for listening. I'll see you all next week. That's it for another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Thank you for joining me, and thanks again to our new sponsor, Revive Active. We've been talking about the importance of steady, sustainable energy, and that's exactly what this daily drink provides. Whether you're out for a walk, on the way to the gym, coming home from work, or catching up on your favourite podcasts, Revive Active supports your well-being at every stage of life. It's Ireland's #1 vitamin and dietary supplement brand for a reason. You can find the full range, including their specific capsules for sleep and calm, at reviveactive.com or your local health food store or pharmacy. Thanks for listening, stay safe, and I'll talk to you all again next week.
Go Loud presents Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Brought to you by Revive Active, Ireland's #1 vitamin and dietary supplement brand. Find out more at reviveactive.com or your local pharmacy and health food stores.